Okay, now we're live on YouTube again. We're not going through Riverside this time. Can you please refresh your YouTube and tell me? And does it appear that sorry, people. Are we live on YouTube?
Lost you.
No, we're not live on YouTube?
1 second.
You don't know whether or not we're live on YouTube?
I do not. Live. Okay.
We are live on YouTube?
We are live.
Okay, and it's going through the computer audio and not these mics?
Correct.
Okay, so the mics are useless. Now, if Jeff and I are all the way back here, if we're all the way back here, Jeff, can you speak?
Hello.
Does it sound good? Because the computer's like 5 feet away. Mics are useless?
We can hear it.
Okay, so now I need to make sure we have the proper link. So please bear with me, people. This first few minutes is going to be basically useless because I do have to make sure that anyone who wants to tune on Twitter actually has the proper link. And I'm not sure if that's it. How do I get? Nope. Where did you see that we're live on YouTube?
I'm literally watching it.
If you go to the live tab, on my YouTube, it's not connecting. I'm not seeing it. Please help.
Yeah. When you go to your main profile, YouTube at some therapist.
Yeah.
It's the first thing at the top.
It's not. You're live. No. It says thanks for tuning in. Ended 7 minutes ago. Watch replay. Yes, I know. That's not getting me anywhere. I might be. That link doesn't take us anywhere. So, okay. Sorry. I don't understand what you're seeing.
It's currently live. You just
go to my YouTube and show me where that is on my YouTube. If you click that, you're saying it's there? Because if I look, that's not what's happening.
Are you on YouTube, Jeff? Can you see it?
Yeah, I just pulled it up and it shows live.
Now
it's the second entry.
Okay. I apologize. This has been. We are not technically equipped to do this. These microphones are useless. This is not going through my Riverside studio. It's going directly to YouTube. And
it's going straight to the people.
Okay.
Yes.
And so is it the same link? Can you verify that the link I tweeted out is the link that people can watch this through right now?
Well, that lands them on your YouTube page, which they should be able to click through to the live.
Okay, I thought I gave a link to this specific.
It doesn't go straight to the live, but it takes them where they would see it very obviously.
All right. Okay. Thanks for bearing with us. Every time I do a live stream, it's trial and error because I've done, I don't know, less than 10. And thanks, Jeff, for bearing with us.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to try to laugh off the awkwardness and the frustration of struggling to connect my Riverside FM platform that I record through with my YouTube studio, with the equipment, with the correct links. That's all of that is what we've been struggling with. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you for bearing with us. If you are here, this is Jeff Myers. He is a parent in the Beaverton School District, which is a suburb of Portland, Oregon. Lately, I've been trying to get more involved in local community and, because I think it's more fun that way. I get to actually have someone over to my living room and find out about what's happening locally. So today we're going to talk about why Jeff is running for Beaverton School Board. So first of all, thanks for tuning in. We imagine this will be especially relevant to Oregon parents, most particularly Beaverton suburb and Northwest Portland, but all over Portland and anyone who's interested in what's happening in the schools right now. So, Jeff, I thought we'd start with the basics. I'm going into this knowing very little about how all of this kind of stuff works.
Yeah.
So, what does a school board do, and what does running for board give you the power to weigh in on?
No, that is a good question. So first, for those I haven't met, so my name's Jeff Myers. I think as you see on the link there, I'm a dad of 2 kids in the district, a former student of the district from the 3rd through the 12th grade. So I graduated 30 years ago. District was very different back then than it is now, and that's not necessarily good or bad. But it's interesting just to see through my kids the different experience that they get. And as far as running for school board, or what does the school board do? I think it's a great question, because I didn't know a couple of years ago when I started really trying to understand what was going on in schools, and attended some of my first board meetings ever, started speaking at them. It was a learning journey as far as what is a board actually responsible for. And in some ways they're like a corporate board, if you're familiar, right? Where they're not involved in the day-to-day operation of a school district. They are more the governing body over it. So they're not going to make day-to-day decisions about like an individual student or discipline. They're going to address sort of broader policy things like, how are we going to, what are the guardrails for discipline within our district, or what curriculum will we use, or hiring a new superintendent, right? So we hired a new superintendent last summer. So he's been here less than a year now. Those are sort of the bigger, broader decisions that a board does. They don't get involved in, again, like there's so many things they don't do. Maybe that's a good way to frame it, as they don't get involved in teacher training. Because there were some questions that came up at the candidate forum that I was at this past Tuesday, that I'd say some of the questions they're really good questions, but they're maybe aimed at more the administration. The superintendent could answer those, or should answer those. That they're not something a board member would even decide. I don't know if that's a good way to kind of frame it. You're one of 7 people. The district presents things to you and you make decisions, right? That's a lot of what the board does, but they're, again, very broad strategic decisions, not day to day.
And some of those decisions are about budget allocation.
That is a huge one. Yeah. We're in budget season right now. I'm sure if anyone's paid attention to the news, right, we get the legislatures in session, and they're determining what will be the next the funding for the next biennium. And so you probably hear a lot about state school fund, and is it going to be 9.9 billion, 10.3 billion? I can't remember what the largest number that Governor Kotek wanted, 11 point something billion. Those figures matter because they determine how much we get per kid. And however many kids we have in the district is how much money basically that we get. And then it's up to the board to not even necessarily decide the budget. They're approving the budget. So the district will do the work to say, here's what we think we should do. Here are recommendations for how many teachers, or how much we want to allocate for technology or curriculum. And the board and their appointed budget committee members ask questions. And so they'll, through that discussion, land on what is the final approved budget for the district. But again, this is where I've learned, and I think a lot of people are learning together, that boards don't decide. They're not the ones saying, okay, we're going to focus on this area, we're going to allocate X amount for something. No, it's more they'll ask questions and give guidance to the district, and then they'll decide how they want to lay that out. And the board will either approve it or tell them to go back and redo it.
So when it comes to budget, what are some of the areas that are most contested right now amongst either current school board members or others? Like I was looking over some of your material before this conversation, and I saw, for example, that you said that I think only 44% of the budget goes to paying teachers. So it seems like there's some disagreement over, on the one hand, candidates say that they want teachers to be paid more, but on the other hand, it seems like there's disagreement about all these other administrators and what they do and the importance of those roles. Would you say that's a frequent source of contention, or what are some of the other budget disputes?
Yeah, that is, so I'm a numbers person. I work in sales operations. That's my day job, but I seem to never talk about it anymore. It's all about education, which it should be. My day job is boring. But the 44% figure you're thinking of is actually the percent of staff that are teachers, classroom teachers, versus everything else. And it's interesting if, again, from a data perspective, if you look at over the last 20 years, Oregon used to be 49%. This is an Oregon figure, not just Beaverton, but I think most school districts, especially larger ones like Beaverton, are right in line with that, where we had roughly half of our staff were teachers, and the other half were principals, administrators, counselors, bus drivers, people, nutrition services. I mean, everything else that takes to operate a school. But we've seen that number dwindle down to now 44%, which 5% doesn't sound like a lot, but across all of Oregon, we're talking about a shift of thousands of staff members away from teaching in classrooms to other roles. And that has definitely been a concern of mine. And I think indirectly a concern of others, if that makes sense, because the outcome of that are larger class sizes, right? And that's what we hear teachers talking about, or I've talked to a lot of teachers today. We have kindergarten classes where I have 32 kids, which is, I think that's or I may have the number off, but that might be around the maximum you can have by rule. So we have some pretty ridiculously high class sizes. Not all are that bad, but in general, we've seen class sizes go up, which is not surprising, because when you see the number of teachers going down, students don't go down as fast, class sizes get larger, and where those budget dollars are going are to other positions, which are, could be central office administrators. But I think, especially in Beaverton, I can speak to that very clearly, is a lot of those positions have gone to sort of behavioral wellness support, mental health support, social workers, people, trying to serve children, but not in an academic way. I'm not saying that's good or bad, just saying it's different. And we only have so many dollars. So if we prioritize one thing, something else has to give.
Right. So it's one of those things where almost all people that I've ever talked to would agree that we should have smaller class sizes and teachers should be paid well. But when it comes down to it, a lot of that money, like you say, there is only so much money in the system, and some of it's been going towards these other roles. Now you talk about mental health support in the schools, and that's my field. So for people who don't know who I am, I'm a therapist. My name is Stephanie Wynn, and my podcast is called You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist. This is not an episode of my podcast. This is just a live stream we're doing on my YouTube channel. So it's a YouTube exclusive. If you are a listener of my podcast, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube so you get stuff like this. It's bonus content. But I'm a therapist that I branch out and I talk to people outside of the mental health world as well as within the mental health world about society and culture and politics and things like that. And I've taken somewhat of an interest, not enough to learn a whole lot, but somewhat of an interest in this trend where it seems like there's a lot more emphasis on so-called mental health in the school system and in other areas of life, more money and resources being spent there. I remember when I was in school, the term counselor didn't really come up a lot. There might have been some like academic counselors that every now and then, if someone was doing really poorly, they had to meet with. I just don't remember mental health and counseling taking up a lot of space in the schools. I don't know when or how that's shifted. I do know that when a little over 10 years ago, it would have been 2012 to 2013, my first practicum internship when I was still in grad school was at an elementary school. So the elementary school partnered with this sort of group of unpaid graduate students so that any kids that seemed like they needed some counseling could get that in the school setting. And I know that's become increasingly common. But then there are also full-time paid employees who are licensed mental health professionals. I know there's also some licenses that are unique to the school counseling setting. So does it seem to you, Jeff, like there has been a shift toward more emphasis on mental health in the schools, and why do you think that is? And do you think do you think that the way that's being done is fulfilling its intended purpose, or is it missing the mark?
Yeah, those are some good questions. So, yeah, I went to school. I graduated 30 years ago, and I remember our first, like, we had counselors, like you're saying, who were academic, but then we had somebody who was, I think, a psychologist, or yeah, I think that's what I think we called her our school psychologist. And the first time I had somebody in that role was in high school. So I guess only in high school did you have struggles, but and no, we know we'd had them elsewhere, but it's different now. And I'd say there's definitely been, I mean, really, if you just read anything that seems to be coming out from schools, it is all about the support of kids in non-academic ways, which, again, I'm not saying that kids aren't struggling. My kids struggle. I struggle. I mean, I think everyone now, especially post-pandemic, has some sort of condition, but, and I'm not making light of that, by the way, at all. But I think the investment has gone overboard, or maybe I'd put it in, it's a difficult subject, and I get it. And I'm not saying, what am I saying? I think we're trying to treat a symptom, and we're not dealing with the right cause. So I think of things in terms of, like, I want to get to a root cause, and you can't always do that, and especially when you're looking at a large population of every kid's unique. How do you come up with a root cause analysis why all these kids all of a sudden seem to need all these different supports? But I'd say that what we're doing is continuing to invest in areas to say we need them to feel heard, we need them to have safe places, but we're not actually making those places safe. What I mean is that schools are inherently not safe today, or not as safe as they were years ago. There's violence or disruptions. Ask any teacher who's been teaching in this district, even if we just focus on Beaverton for the last 10 years, and they'll say, yeah, classrooms are a lot more out of control than they were before. And if you just think in terms of brain chemistry, and if kids are reacting to or seeing violence or seeing disruptions around them, you've got the cortisol pumping through. And so they're just in this stressful situation, and it's making them jittery and wanting to react and do things. And if it's happening every day or multiple times a week, it becomes chronic. And so now you have a bunch of chronically stressed out, chronically anxious children and staff members, teachers. And what we're doing is we're saying, well, we need to have more training, more social emotional learning, more social workers, more mental health supports to deal with the symptom, but we're not treating the cause. So I'm sorry, kind of stumbling around, because it is a very loaded, divisive, it shouldn't be a divisive topic, but it's a sensitive one. And one where I just feel we're missing the mark if we keep trying to invest in these folks to do this work, when we're not treating the real issue that's underneath, which is we just don't have safe learning environments. And it's not about affirming people to safety. It's about physically keeping them safe. And I struggle seeing that our schools continue to make choices that ignore the real problem.
Well, I think you're talking about several important, interrelated yet distinct issues. So there's the issue of safety in the schools, which I want to understand more, because you're alluding to it now. You've also talked and written about this in some of the other stuff that I was looking at this morning, just to prepare for talking to you, that we have issues of actual physical safety in the schools. And of course, you're right that and in psychology, we've had this concept for a long time of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that if you don't have your most basic needs for safety and nutrition and things like that in place, how are you going to concentrate on learning? How are you going to be curious? Of course, that makes sense. But I'm also hearing you talk about sort of the appropriateness of blending the worlds of counseling and all that entails with the emotional vulnerability and the school setting. So I talked with Deb Philman. I don't know if you know her. She's an expert on education. I'm trying to remember her YouTube channel is The Reason We Learn. So I've been on her show. She's been on mine. And I believe it was a clip from one of our episodes that she called "Are Schools Violating the Emotional Boundaries of Children?" And she wanted my take, because she's an expert on education. She wanted my take as a therapist on some of the trends that she's observed with regard to this sort of blending of the school setting and the emphasis on mental health.
Mhm.
And here's one angle that I bring to that conversation. I certainly don't know all that there is to know on that topic, but I do know that when I'm providing counseling, it's really important to me that the person coming to me is coming of their own free will. Now, there are therapists who work in different settings besides that, like people who provide counseling for those who are mandated by the criminal justice system to receive counseling. That's a specialty that I don't do. I've also worked with people who were, I guess you could say, like more or less required to do therapy by their involvement in child protective services, things like that. And I guess I'm kind of classical in my approach in some ways, because I think that therapy needs to be a setting where a person is coming of their own free will, and it is sometimes the one place in their life where they feel like this is a neutral person who doesn't have an agenda for me. And that's a big part of the reason that a lot of people come to me is they're like, you know, my husband wants this for me, my sister wants that, my employer wants this, my kid wants that. Everybody has their opinion of what I should be doing or how I should change, and it's all based on how it would serve them better. And I need to find my voice. I need to know what's right for me. And maybe in the end, some of that is going to be that I'm going to grow and change in ways that these people close to me in life would really like. But maybe I'm going to set boundaries that people aren't going to like. So I need that neutral third party, that therapist who I'm paying them for their time and there's no strings attached, so that I can sort myself out. So that's the ideal setting for therapy, is when it really does have that kind of boundary to protect it.
Yeah.
And when I think about children being brought to therapy at all, now there are many situations in which a child might be brought to therapy and many ways that could go, but there's always that added dimension of how my parents want this for me or don't want this for me.
Right.
That adds a dimension of what the therapist and the client, if the client is a child, need to sort out with regard to how the child feels about even being there. Because how the child feels about being in therapy and what assumptions they have about the therapist's agenda for them is going to shape the process. Now, add in this other dimension of my teacher wants me to be here, my principal wants me to be here, my fellow students see me coming and going, or let's say it's not individual counseling in the school setting. Let's say it's these sort of groups where the school counselor, and I've heard of this happening and I don't have the details, but sometimes like the school counselor takes a group of kids and does something with them in the same way that the art teacher or the science might go off and do a certain activity. And so then it's like, it kind of confuses it, you know, and maybe that's where it gets in this idea of social emotional learning, that it's the learning part, that just like we learn how to use computers and we learn how to paint, we also learn how to talk about our feelings, or we learn how to, and like in theory, I don't have a problem with that. I think if we put it in the broadest sense possible, it sounds like maybe a positive thing.
Right.
But in practice, I wonder if it creates some confusion for children that could be anxiety provoking with regard to, what am I looking for? Sorry, I was just distracted by the doorbell. It's probably just a package. I think it can create some confusion about the differences between thoughts, feelings, and actions, private and public life. Like, so differentiation is healthy psychologically. It's healthy to have a sense of differentiation between myself and you. So I know we're separate people, and you can be in pain and I can care about you, but I don't have to collapse into that pain and freak out about it with you. That's not going to help you, right? So there's healthy differentiation here. And then there's healthy differentiation between thoughts, feelings, and actions. So healthy differentiation between thoughts, feelings, and actions means I can have an emotion, and this is really important for kids, right? Okay, sorry. They're ringing a second time. I got to find out what this is about. Yes? Yes? Hey guys, wait. Oh, you I'm live streaming in the living room right now. Can you come down, please? Yeah.
Life happens. It always does.
Okay. Pardon the interruption. So it's healthy to recognize that I can have an emotion like anger, and there are different things I can do with that emotion besides punch someone or yell.
Yes.
Right. So thoughts, feelings, and actions are separate, and that's good. And I would be happy to know that kids are learning that. But I think when it comes to the boundaries that we have in schools, my concern is that emotions, emotions can be a private matter. And my concern is if children feel like there's an obligation on them to talk about their feelings, when really the only obligation in the school setting is to behave a certain way, right? And there's a distinction between your behavior and your feelings. Like you could be feeling worried or sad or pissed off, but you can also have the it's healthy to have a degree of self-trust that even though I'm having these feelings, I can look forward to the end of the day when I'm going to blow off some steam and go play tennis with my dad, and that's going to be helpful. And until now and then, I'm going to focus on math. Or I don't have to like Jamie. I just have to not scream at Jamie to get through the rest of the day. As long as I don't scream at Jamie or punch Jamie, I can have my feelings of how much I don't like Jamie, right? So children, I think, to grow up emotionally healthy need that differentiation where they can have their feelings be a private matter, and that the expectation in the school setting, are you going to go down and talk to them? They're outside. Did you hear that?
Ooh.
Your children.
Oh, there.
They rang the doorbell and interrupted the live stream.
Like I said, life happens.
Okay. Anyway, what's the point? So I just don't know. I actually don't know enough about the nature of what's being taught in these schools to know, is this ultimately in the kids' best interest, or does it make them feel like when they show up to a school setting where they actually need some boundaries because they're going to be around hundreds of people, right? If you're going to be around any setting where you have hundreds of people, and this goes for childhood and adulthood, it goes for school and work and volunteer and all the different settings that we're in, like you need to be able to feel like, not that I have to put up necessarily a wall or a mask, but just I get to have a bit of a bubble around me where I choose how much I share. And as long as I can cooperate with the rules of what's expected of me in this environment, that, I don't interrupt, that I follow some basic rules and standards of decorum, that ultimately my feelings are still my private matter. And if I want to share my feelings with someone, then great. As long as it's, appropriate time and place for that, it can be very healthy to do so. But my concern hearing about these trends in the schools is that the kids might be learning that when I go into this environment where I actually need to have some boundaries because I'm going to have to move through all these different types of people and energies, and I'm going to have to deal with various mental and physical and emotional challenges, that I have to be exposed because I have to be ready to be vulnerable and talk about my feelings with whoever, even if I don't like them or I don't trust them or I don't know them. And I think that can actually create more anxiety in the long run and more kind of confusion about the expectations. Whereas when the boundaries are clear, when the rules of the game are clear, it tends to create more ease. And especially for children, they need to know where those boundaries are. Earlier on that note, you mentioned how there's this kind of ethos of like children need to be heard. Like, yes and no. There's times that children just need to know where the lines are drawn. And if they have too much of a say, it can actually be confusing, because why should they be in the driver's seat? They don't have the life experience to know how the situation should be guided. Do you think, I think sometimes adults giving too much credit to a kid's degree of insight or maturity on an issue, again, just creates more kind of boundary confusion, which can lead to more anxiety, therefore more emotional dysregulation, and more of the very issues that these programs are supposedly designed to impact. I don't know. What do you think about that?
No, I agree. Yes, with everything. No, I do. But you just made me think of something and connect. This is why I love having conversations with different people with different backgrounds, because it just helps connect dots of things that maybe something I heard or something that was said before. There seems to be this trend of treating children as if they're adults, like as if they're ready for all these really big, meaty topics. And there are some good aspects to, like, I've talked with my wife at length, and we disagreed for the longest time about social emotional learning, because I said, this thing is, it's horrible, it's going too far. And she's saying, no, social emotional learning is important. It's good. There's like red, yellow, green, helping kids understand their feelings. And when they're red, maybe this is a tactic they can use to calm down and self-regulate. And then I thought, well, what you're talking about is not what I'm seeing in this school. But she taught in a different district. She taught in Washington, and it's like there's different levels of social emotional learning. But I guess the connection that you made was the what's age appropriate, and I'll make a weird connection to something that's in the news. Well, the author of the new social science curriculum for kindergarten through 5th grade in elementary, so in Beaverton School District, and that author, she was the author of a book called Social Studies for a Better World. Her name's Dr. Katie Swalwell. And one of her beliefs in her book, again, this isn't necessarily in our curriculum, although you see the connection between this book she just released and our curriculum that she wrote for us, where her feeling is the knowledge that kids need is already in the room, and that a teacher's role is to facilitate discussions and facilitate the sharing of knowledge, not to teach information, like not to teach, like, here's the Civil War and this is what happened. It's that somehow all the kids already know what they need to know for their grade level is already in their head. And it's about sharing their views of something. And for one, I completely disagree with that, because I'd say, and again, I compare the curriculum. Actually, there's another candidate running in Zone 3 for this election, Connie Clemens, and she used to teach in the district, and she did a phenomenal job in a meeting a couple of weeks ago, or an event, where she described, this is what I taught in 4th grade social science, and this is current 4th grade social science. And she went through it, like, we taught, how to use maps and an atlas and the Civil War and this and that, and now we teach identity and the plights of the indigenous people. And so it starts, again, I know this is connecting a lot of dots here, and you're catching this all live. Sorry, folks. But the idea that kids can be treated like they're older, and even some people at the board, the candidate forum mentioned this, that kids are ready. They're prepared to handle anything. We don't give them enough credit. No, they're not. They're kids. They're not ready. I mean, kindergartners are not ready to understand what a two-spirits gender identity is, and that is actually in the curriculum. They're not ready.
It's in the kindergarten curriculum.
Yeah, like I always travel with some of the notes from the curriculum.
Yeah. Let's take a look.
But the point would be that kids are not ready for the discussions they're having. They're not. The knowledge isn't already in their head, and it's about facilitating the knowledge. I don't think any teacher would agree that their job is as a facilitator and a mediator. It's teacher. They have information that the kids don't, and we need to help convey that to them and help it stick so that they can eventually grow into be adults and contribute to society. They need a base level of information. They're not born with it. And
this reminds me of a podcast episode I did with Matt Osborne, The Myth of the Magical Child. And we talked about how this sort of glorified divine image of this mystical child that carries this divine knowledge kind of rushes in to fill this religious void in our secular society. And the unspoken logic, I think, underlying all of it is this idea that children are closer to God. and a longing to connect with that sort of pure divine light through glorifying the child. And what a lot of, I think, adults who engage in this kind of behavior don't realize is that when you treat a child that way, you're actually breeding narcissism in the child.
Oh, yeah.
And you're creating a really anxiety provoking situation because you're reversing the roles. You're looking to a child for guidance. Really, the child is looking to you for guidance. Now, that doesn't mean there's not a grain of truth in the ideas you describe. I think if I were to try to steel man my opponent in this regard, I would say, there is something, there's definitely wisdom in evoking the child's own natural learning process. I think there's definitely something a little too top down about the way certain things are taught. And I think preserving a child's love of learning by supporting their own ways of figuring things out is great, but that doesn't mean they already have the knowledge. It means that your role is at minimum to scaffold their discovery through at least providing some guidance and structure. And that's with the learning process itself. Now, you are definitely the one who has the knowledge, especially if you're teaching something like history or math. I mean, how is that knowledge already going to be in there? But what did you bring here?
Well, so I just, these are just some snippets there. I mean, when you talk about a curriculum that's social science across grades K-5, a couple of sheets of paper don't do it justice, but I've actually received from the district the entire curriculum that they've been writing throughout the year. And, so I just, again, these are snippets, but like in kindergarten, to say that this is, again, a definition that they use as part of a lesson that says that gender is how we identify as a girl, boy, non-binary, two-spirit person, etc. And I mean, this is probably definitely more your area of expertise than mine. But
yeah, let's just talk about this for a moment, okay? So the paradox of choice. We live in a day and age that we have so many choices relative to the sort of natural and economic limits that have been imposed on us, and the limits of technology that we've been accustomed to as human beings. We have relatively more choice today than we've really evolved to be able to wrap our minds around. And more choice does not make us happier. More choice is confounding. It leads us to doubt the choices we've made, to wonder if we would have been happier if we'd taken the other path. We've been watching lately Indian matchmaking. You ever seen that show?
Oh, no.
And they show all these couples that, they've been married 40 years. And they're talking about, well, I decided it was time to get married. So my parents met his parents, and then we decided to get married, and now we've been married ever since. And I'm not saying that we should all switch to Indian matchmaking. It's not our culture, but it just goes to show. I mean, there are people who are perfectly happy in these long-term marriages with someone they did not pick, someone that was picked for them. So that's just one example of ways in which sometimes more choice is not always better. And so the biological sex of your body is one of those hard limits imposed by nature, though. And it's one of the few we have remaining in a day and age where I could whip out my phone, and at the push of the button, I could have any number of products from all over the world shipped to my door in 24 hours. I could eat cuisine from all over the world in half an hour. I mean, we have so many choices. But to confuse children about this basic fact of biology, that you do not choose your sex, that's one of those things that was determined for you at the moment of conception, and like, hallelujah, just accept that as a given. You're male or female. Now from there, you have a lot of choice about what kind of personality you develop. Some of it's genetic, some of it's nurture, but there is arguably an element of free will with regard to how you develop your character, your interests, your values, your hobbies, what kind of people you like to spend time with, and how you like to dress and groom yourself. Those are all things that naturally children, especially as they head into adolescence, experiment with until you kind of reach a relatively stable point in adulthood, although those things do continue to develop for the rest of adulthood. But But it is, I think, so disastrous for children's mental health to present this idea that one of the few things you do not have a choice about is something that you actually have a choice about. We know that's not true. We know that you can't pick your gender, and that any attempts to try to become the opposite sex or some other gender identity only lead to worse medical outcomes and foreshortened lifespans and increased risk of suicide due to medical complications and a host of other factors. As anyone who's not come across my work on this before, I'm wearing a shirt made by Laura Becker, who's been a guest on my podcast for D-Trans Awareness Day. So I do a lot of D-Trans advocacy. I talk about the experiences of people who feel like they were harmed by this experimental gender medicine. But I was talking to a parent the other day with one of these kids who's confused about gender, and the kid had said something like to the parent, like, with regard to the idea of being non-binary, they said, well, I just don't feel like people should have to choose. And we were talking about, oh, well, yeah, exactly. Like, this is a place where actually you could agree with your child. People shouldn't ever be put in a position where there's this idea that you have to choose your gender, because it was already chosen for you. and it does make you crazy, navel gazing and introspecting about this really abstract concept that there's no way to tell, right? It's not like I can, look at my fingers and notice which finger is longer and then that determines something about me. I can't, I can tell what my hair color is, I can tell what my eye color is, I can tell how tall Jeff is, but there's no amount of introspecting that can come up with a definitive answer as to what my gender identity is, because there is no such thing as a gender identity. There's no biological evidence that exists. There's no brain scans. The brain scan theory has been debunked. It simply reveals that actually has more to do with sexual orientation. If you take out homosexuality, then people's brains are consistent with typical brains of their biological sex. And there's a lot more information I could share on that, but I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole right now. My point is that I think it's disastrous for children's mental health to be presented with this idea that this gender is something you can and should introspect about and pick. Also, from a mental health perspective, the default mode network refers to brain circuitry involved in our mind wandering. So people with higher degrees of neuroticism, higher rates of depression and anxiety spend more time in the default mode network as opposed to the task positive network, which is like what's active right now, because I'm very focused on the task at hand, which is talking to Jeff and to our audience. So people who are more neurotic, more prone to depression and anxiety, spend more time ruminating and mind wandering and less time engaged and focused in the present moment. It's also harder for them to be engaged and present in the present moment. And we know that depression and anxiety is associated particularly with having not only more time in the default mode network, but more introspection and rumination and self-criticism. So this idea that you should go looking for your gender identity, that this is even a thing to spend time on, rather than just accepting like I did, like you did when we were growing up, I'm female, I'm male, respectively, and moving on from there, has got to be disastrous, because it reinforces introspection, not in a helpful way, not in a way that builds mindfulness or self-compassion or the ability to sort of lovingly self-correct for one's, potential flaws, but introspection in sort of a self-absorbed way. And I think it makes people crazy. That's my opinion. That's my professional or unprofessional opinion on this. And it's also a highly abstract concept. Like, even if you entertain the notion that this is a real thing, it's still a very abstract concept. And kindergartners are not capable of abstract thought. They're in a concrete...
An abstract thought that is continually evolving, right? Too, where the definition, sorry to interrupt, but like the definition of what the different identities are, what you could be year to year, we're seeing that the categories are changing. It's just, how do they even keep up? Like, so what a kindergarten learns this year will be different than what we talk about next year, because it is evolving so rapidly. Schools can't even keep up. That's why I think you see so many different variations within even Oregon. We're all under the same rules and law, but different districts. And it's not just because they have a board that believes one way or another. I think they're just all struggling to keep up with what are the terms we should use? What should we bake into our curriculum? And what are we doing now? I mean, we adopted these optional social science standards early because we wanted to be first district in Oregon, the first state in the country that has integrated ethnic studies into social sciences, which sounds nice, but what if you look at the standards, they're not. But the standards are changing again. This is what I warned the district about too. I said, by adopting these, you're adopting standards that could still change by the time they're implemented in 26, 27. And they just announced last week, ODE is going to revise. They're looking for teachers to revise the standards for 2024. So we're going to have to change again. So anyway, there's so many things there.
Of
but
course, kids are anxious. The adults are anxious. The adults are anxious trying to figure out, like, this says K. Is that for kindergarten? Because I can see what's on his lap. This one, will you read that, please? The top one.
Yeah, gender expression, how we look, speak, or act in a more masculine or in more masculine or feminine ways.
What the heck kind of sense does that make to a kindergartner?
Kindergartners, so my wife had taught this for years, and she sees stuff like this, which, she's definitely, understands these things. We talk a ton. I'd say she's probably, having taught it, has a different lens to look through, but she'll tell stories of kindergartners where they don't even know what color they are. Like, two kids will come up. Actually, somebody else told me the story of, like, two kids came up dressed as the same, like, Halloween costume, and they wanted to fool somebody and try to trick them of who's who. One kid was white, one kid was black, right? And so we've all heard stories like that. They don't get these things. They don't even understand their skin color, let alone their gender expression or gender identity.
And good for them. Like,
yes.
I feel like we should be protecting that. Like, that's so innocent and cute and sweet. And
like, we find it funny. It's like, oh, that's so cute. But it's great that you don't know that. Just like some kids, sorry if any are watching, like, they're, is Santa Claus real or not? Different families have different views of that, of what's appropriate, whether you even believe in it. But it is special if they do believe and you support it. And it's also special when they don't, and that transition that they make. And they'll make it when they need to make it. There's not like a lesson that says,
Can I look through?
Oh yeah, there's all sorts of stuff. There's no one right age to know when there's a tooth fairy or a Santa Claus, but maybe that's coming. I don't know. You said something else. Sorry to kind of keep going. Use the word experiment or experimentation or something along those lines, and I called it out at a school board meeting back in January. And I've gotten some flack and some support for yelling at the school board at the end of saying, our kids are not your experiment. And it was, I'm forgetting the book now I got that from, but it's the idea of tactical emotion, meaning like I went in planning to do that. I am, I'm learning empathy. I didn't have it as a kid. I'm in my 40s. I've been trying to develop it, but there's so many things that you could call an experiment, and that can provoke a lot of emotions. But I'd say schools have dipped not just their toe, but like a whole leg or two in this pool of experimentation with curriculum, right? So this, we're using optional standards that are very, very different in social science, and they've produced very, very different curriculum that has things like, gender identity in kindergarten, or one of my personal non-favorites is the definition of racism being only benefiting white people.
Just looking at that.
Yeah, a system that advantages white people and hurts people of color. And, that's in the curriculum. Like that, this is my daughter's grade, 5th grade, that they're teaching 5th graders that you're only racist if you're white, and you're a victim if you're a person of color. And then again, knowing the author, she doesn't capitalize white, but capitalizes people of color in the name of equity and justice. But this is just one example of we're experimenting with new curriculum. We're experimenting with a reading program. There's parents who have spoken out about kids who are illiterate, who are like, I know a parent who has a junior who was so brave and spoke up at a listening session and mentioned that the school system robbed him of his education. And can you imagine if yourself as a high schooler being brave enough to get up in front of a room of adults and say, I can't read because of you, schools. And it's because we use units of study by Lucy Calkins. It's been debunked as of 2020 as far as its effectiveness in reading, and the district still uses it. And we're still going to use it next year. We're augmenting it, but we're still using a broken experimental, not state approved curriculum because we want to experiment. We use a new disciplinary method that doesn't work. We've used it for 10 years. We experiment in gender. I mean, our sex ed standards our curriculum is changing like every 2 years. The standards change every 2 years versus normal curriculum changes every 7 years. We're trying to go way too fast into areas that are just dangerous. And we're not stepping back to see, like, is this helping children or is this causing more problems? And I would argue it, and the data proves it out, it's causing more problems. Sorry, I just kind of went off on a tangent there, but these are deep. That's why I'm running for school board, because after 2 years of speaking to parents and teachers and people in the community, people around the state, legislators now. I mean, I don't even know who I am. 2 years ago, I barely attended a board meeting, and now I'm here. Hi, talking about this stuff. It's crazy. And even as one board member, I know I can help make a difference. And by just raising these issues that don't get raised, our current board members are just, sounds great, rubber stamp, sounds great, rubber stamp.
So I would think that people whose career involves working with children would be better versed in developmental psychology than myself as a therapist. At least the elements of developmental psychology that are relevant to the learning process. But every time I have one of these conversations, I'm just coming across more and more stuff that's so developmentally inappropriate. And I'll use an example. So these definitions, like the definition of racism here, as you said earlier, a system that advantages white people and hurts people of color, white, uncapitalized, people of color, capitalized, by excluding and discriminating against anyone who is not considered a white person. I think this is developmentally inappropriate, at least. And I'll give an example that goes back to my own childhood. So I grew up as a minority in a predominantly African-American community in the early 90s. And I was 7 years old when the Rodney King beating riots happened. And that was my neighborhood. And so I got to experience firsthand the ramifications of all these inner city Black kids being taught by their parents about race relations in the US. And it wasn't being taught in the school in this way, but kids were hearing all these things to explain to them all this racial tension. And you imagine what their little brains, their little 3rd and 4th and 5th grade brains made out of what they were hearing at home. Well, it manifested as, she's a white girl, let's go get her. And I got beaten up and targeted and harassed daily, and like to basically develop complex PTSD from years of being targeted as the scapegoat for all of the history of race relations in the US. And it frightens me to imagine how much that could be happening to other kids, not because there's nothing to be taught about the history of race relations in the United States, but you're taking an 8, 9, 10-year-old brain and giving it a whole lot of information about some really bothersome stuff. And you're not taking upon yourself as an educator or as a parent the responsibility to find developmentally appropriate ways of explaining the nuances. Well, we're all prone to black and white thinking, and this is literal black and white thinking that can have some really harmful consequences that ultimately just repeating cycles of violence because of how kids understand good and bad and right and wrong and good guys and bad guys and things like that. So it seems to me really irresponsible to be teaching kids things like this.
Yeah. And you got to wonder, it's like, well, we're seeing way more violence in schools and disruptions in classrooms. And you know what I mean? Disruption in classrooms just be kids who show up a few minutes late and teachers trying to talk and they're just doing their own thing. They're on their phone. They've got their AirPods in. They're, rustling around. They're talking to friends. I mean, this is normal everyday classrooms now where they're just not getting to the learning. And it's because their minds are being blown by these things that they're just not ready for. And I think I've said this to others, like there will be studies and there will be books written about this time and this stuff that's happened in schools when we'll reflect back and realize, wow, we really effed up. Like we really screwed up some years in there where we just went too far in a direction. And I will say, I didn't say this earlier, I want to make it clear. Like, I think most teachers, most administrators are good. They're in the profession not because they're like, I want to experiment on kids and do crazy things and see what works.
Mm-hmm.
No, they truly love children and love teaching and love supporting kids, or love making them lunch or driving them to school or taking them home. It's what they love to do. But they love it a whole lot less now because it's so stressful. They're getting injured, physically, emotionally, mentally. I mean, they are burned out, but they are genuinely good people. It's the fringe. It's the few that have a loud voice that are pushing in these directions because they say all the right things of we're supporting kids, we're meeting where they are, we're hearing them. The knowledge is already in their heads. They need to be affirmed to be alive. There's one question I had for you, whether you maybe answer at some point. I'm curious your take on, from your learning and your experience, your background, the notion of needing to affirm kids and whatever they believe about themselves or whatever they believe, they need to be affirmed, meaning we have to fix what's external to them for them to be happy, for them to be good, versus if they're struggling with something internal, then deal with that. Let's help deal with that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's so much to be said about that. So,
yeah, sorry.
I mean, I will steel man that position for a second. The risk, okay, if I'm trying to give credit to a well-intentioned person who's expressing that viewpoint, I might say, well, maybe the thing that they're trying to protect kids from might be being like gaslit or dismissed if the kid is having a real experience. Or if anyone's having a real experience and people are, closing their eyes and ears to taking them in, there's a lack of compassion in that. But the mistake is in the collusion that to care about someone means you have to agree with their perspective 100%. That's the lack of differentiation. Like, earlier I was talking about differentiation, right? And that like you can hurt and I can care about you without collapsing into that hurt with you. And when it comes to children, think about all the ways that kids look to the adults in their lives to help them understand how big of a deal is something. The first time you skin your knee, big tears, it really hurts. You don't have enough skinned knee experience to know that this pain will subside, and it doesn't mean that anything's broken, like you're going to be fine, but you need the adults in your life to react in a certain way for you to get it. If they're cold and dismissive, then you don't get that comfort and you don't learn how to self-soothe and you don't feel cared for. But if you skin your knee and your parent acts like you just broke your leg, then it creates more anxiety that reinforces the pain, and you don't get emotion regulation that way either. So when it comes to the idea of affirming, and not even talking about gender, which is a whole other can of worms, but just affirming in general, no, you don't have to agree with someone to care about them. And sometimes the most caring thing you can do is to recognize honestly where you agree and where you disagree, and maybe lead with the agreement. That's a good social skill in general. Say like, I see your point, or I see how you could see it that way. And maybe highlight, like I said, I'm trying to steel man this position. I'm trying to say, here's where I see your point. But also I'm still a separate person. And what you're talking about is really about people kind of reinforcing an external locus of control, that the idea that I need everyone else to agree with me or treat me a certain way in order for me to be happy, that means my happiness is reliant on that. That's not a good foundation for emotion regulation. I mean, there's all this money being put into social emotional learning and school counselors and things like that. But when it comes to basic emotion regulation, that's not a good foundation. And it erodes at genuineness. I think people are happiest when they have genuine relationships. And that's one of the reasons I'm outspoken about the ideological capture of my field of psychotherapy, is that genuineness is really important to the therapeutic relationship. I credit my genuineness with my patients as being a large part of the reason that many people have found our work to be beneficial, because they genuinely feel like I'm being real with them and I care about them, and I will give them my honest opinion when it's called for therapeutically. But the idea that you have to agree with someone is sometimes that means lying to them, and then that creates this sort of false consensus with a lot of preference falsification, and everyone's walking on eggshells.
It's to that point, and this is probably a bad subject, I'm not going to get into deeply, but you see this in sports, right? Where you have women's sports and then you have trans females who are now competing and winning in some competitions. And that's creating this issue of, who do we side with? It's divisive, and I'm not trying to get into that subject necessarily, but to say it's an example of where, well, I want to affirm these trans females who identify that way. So like, let's say, I'm saying as a society, right, we should support them. They're struggling and this is how they identify. But then you have women speaking up who are saying, well, I came in second place because I lost to this person who's a biological male and has advantages. But I can't affirm their feelings because I have to affirm the more marginalized one. And it's anyone's head who doesn't explode trying to process the right way to handle that is just fooling themselves. It is complex, and it is a new area that we're all experiencing and trying to understand. Like, I don't even know what's right or wrong or whose voice to listen to, but yet kids are ready for this. And let's talk about kids, and let's no, this is all happening so fast, and it is. I don't have any of the answers. I'm just pointing out that these things are complicated, and but it's okay enough that we know we should be teaching it to kids, but it's not okay that we don't even have the right answer as adults in society. It blows my mind that we're dabbling in this area.
Well, I do believe that single-sex spaces are important, and that women's and girls' sports and achievements need to be protected. Mm-hmm. On that note, in the Beaverton School District, I have heard reports even at the elementary school level of female hygiene products in the boys' bathrooms.
Yes.
Is this something that school board members have any say in?
Oh yeah, that's a tough one. So there's the Menstrual Dignity Act, which is it's now law, so it's required that all school districts put feminine hygiene products in every bathroom.
Is this statewide or nationwide?
Statewide. It is just well, as Oregon, we like to lead in some of these areas. Like I said earlier about the curriculum stuff, we want to be first. We're first here, and I do believe that some districts have not followed through, but I'd have to double check to find out what's happened, because generally it's not like there's a carrot to this of here, do this. I think there's some funding that goes with it, but I think there are consequences if they don't. And I mean, I think it's great for some superintendents to try to make a standard, some boards, but I think in the end, once something's law, it's hard. So that's where there's limits. And I've been asked this before. Actually, I got a really good grilling last Monday at a meet and greet from a grandparent, and he just hammered me on some topics, which I thought was great. Like, I just love that he was that engaged, and just like, what are you going to do, and what is the board? And I was very honest and said, well, as a school board member, I mean, for one, this is a volunteer gig for 4 years. I'm not getting paid to take an extra work. Don't feel sorry for me because I want to do it. But that, in the end, we can only decide so much. Like, again, we don't decide what happens in every school. We're not dealing with every operational issue. We're dealing with policy. That's a big part. It's like we define policy, but policy can't trump state law. So in this case, we could, if we wanted to, vote to not have them, but then we're accepting some consequence that maybe we can't even legally do. So I'd say that one is where we're kind of stuck, but also we can raise that issue and say, work with our legislators, work with the State Board of Education, and roll up feedback to say, this isn't working, or in these grades, it's not. I mean, I think it's insane. I don't know why we do this. I mean, you could make them available in the office, and then we solve all these problems. But we have to put them in every bathroom to make everyone feel safe for whatever the reason. But
So
Kinda
this is the
financially smart.
Menstrual Dignity Act, and was this
Yeah.
something that was voted on, or like I don't remember when this became a thing?
No, this was passed 2021 or 22. I forget exactly which year, but I mean, this is a recent law, and no, nothing that we had to vote on. It's just, the legislature passes it, and I mean, the Democrats have had a supermajority in the past in the House and the Senate, and then so they could just do whatever they want. There's nothing to stop it. And
Well, we're getting close to running out of time, so I want to make sure we cover the most important things. So you are running in the election. The voting date is what, May 16th?
May 16th. Yep. And then want to make sure we touch on this. We talked about it actually before we started, that if you're in the Beaverton school district boundary, you vote on every zone. There are 3 zones that are up for elections. Zone 3, which is like the northwest Portland east side, northeast side of Beaverton. Zone 6, which is where I am in southwest Beaverton, and then Zone 7 is kind of in the southeast quadrant. But yeah, everyone votes on every candidate. So I already filled out my ballot, so I got to pick who's in zone 36. 7 is running. There's somebody running unopposed. 3, there's 3 candidates. In zone 6, there's me and one other. But again, it's that a lot of people think that I only vote for my zone. School boards, no, if you're in the district boundaries, you vote on all zones. We as board members have to live in particular zones to make sure there's representation from the 7 different areas of the district.
Okay, so that's why there are zones in the first place.
Right, just to make sure you don't have some
out.
people of like, oh, there's just one from one neighborhood. You could have a
Right.
group of 7 who really want to run. It's like, nope, you've had to live in your zone for at least a year before the election. I've lived in, Southwest Beaverton for a long time, but
So you're zone 6.
Zone 6.
And zone 7 is running unopposed. So do you have a pick for zone 3?
Zone 3, yeah, I really like Connie Clemens. She's it's funny, this shouldn't be political. I'd say well, I don't want to speak for her, but she's definitely a more moderate, and I love it. Former teacher. She hasn't taught in a while, which is frankly a good thing, that she's, coming at it again fresh as a grandma. So she's got grandkids in the district, but she, as a former teacher, remembers what did we teach before and sees what we're teaching now, and is, blown away. And she may not be the smoothest speaker, nor am I, but she's real. And I think that's what I was blown away from on the candidate forum this past Tuesday. You had a lot of really good polished answers from 4 people. And then you had 2 of us trying to just be real and share what's happening. And I'd say that's Connie and me. That's yeah.
And so if you are elected, what'll be your priorities? I know at the beginning, and I appreciate anyone who's watched this from start to finish. I don't expect most people have that much of an attention span, or time today. But at the beginning, we talked a little bit about like what a school board member can actually do. So what would be your priorities?
So at a very high level, I think academic rigor. I mean, I think we need to bring back a focus on academics and do what we can to minimize. And this can be done through policy and just through, we're developing a strategic plan right now. So what do the next 5 years of the district look like? It will have been voted on by the time I get in, but it doesn't mean that as a board member, I can't affect how it's rolled out and what it looks like when it's rolled out. And the way I think about it is anything that you do that's not academic. So we do social emotional learning, we do restorative circles, we're going to do anything takes away time from learning. And we already have some of the fewest school days in the country. So I can't say enough that academic rigor and, curriculum like this, I've already filed complaints with the state, with the school board that was ignored, with the state that are still in progress to get this curriculum thrown out because it was adopted illegally, which that maybe can set people off, but the board voted to approve it before it was written. So I'm kind of going off on another tangent, but I've had to look into state law and understand law and policy and rule. And there's nothing in the rules that say that a board is following process when they vote to approve a curriculum that hadn't been written yet. I mean, that's the reality of it. The lessons, the units, the scope and sequence, the definitions like these were written after the board voted to approve it. So as a board member, one of the first things I will do is, if this curriculum has not been thrown out, is to call for a vote on throwing it out and replacing it with something packaged off the shelf. Now, the board could choose to ignore. The chair controls what gets voted on. But as a board member, I can raise the issues versus letting everything quietly not ever get addressed. So people ask, like, how can you, one board member, do anything? It's like, well, I can make sure the issues at least get out there and are public, and I may lose the vote 1-6, but now it's being discussed and now it's out there to where others can cover it versus not even letting these issues get addressed. So it's prioritizing, proven academic approaches, not the Lucy Calkins reading. I mean, that should be thrown out immediately, like Portland already did. The second would be safety, discipline, getting rid of disciplinary methods that haven't worked for 9.5 years. We're still using restorative practices that are, any school district that's adopted these is experiencing the same disruptive, violent behavior. And it's funny that they can't connect the dots to what all started when they started implementing this approach.
Do you think people really want to believe in restorative justice, and they just don't want to face the fact that sometimes we learn through consequences, not through conversations? I mean, I'm thinking about, I'm a big fan of Leonard Sachs, his books on the different needs of boys and girls. And, girls, females, we have, our deepest emotional centers of the brain are actually more closely linked to our verbal centers than they are for males. And it can actually be anxiety provoking and frustrating for boys to be pressured to conform to this sort of female centric way of talking about our problems and things like that. And boys actually learn better through having more rules and consequences and knowing what the boundaries are of the game. And I think restorative justice, from what I know about it, just sounds maybe a little too vague and abstract and a little kind of pie in the sky. And maybe the people who want to idealize this magical, mystical child who's so close to God don't want to face that, like, there are parts of our human nature that need to encounter hard limits, to be refined by those limits. There are so many other things I wish I could talk to you about, like some of your statements on having safety resource officers in the school. When I read about your statements on that, I was wondering about context, like thinking about how children have been exposed to these ideas about how horrible police officers are. And I know there was a conflict recently amongst Beaverton parents about kids being shown a video in which negative things were said about police officers. So of course that's going to feed into how kids feel about those sort of issues. There's many other things I actually wish that I'd gotten to pick your brain about, but I have another appointment in a few minutes. So thank you so much for joining. So if you are in Beaverton School District, please vote by May 16th. Do you know if Portland School District also has the same timing for their election?
I think most counties are right around this time. I'm not positive on the date, but I've seen from other counties May 16th. I'm sure it's somewhere right around there. Ballots are already starting to arrive in different counties around the state. I've seen people post. So yeah, I think if you haven't gotten your ballot yet for wherever you live around here, you will soon.
Oh, and I also want to say, where can people find you? But I also, just one of those other lingering thoughts that I'm like trying to get out before we have to wrap up is I've been thinking about, like, Beaverton's a very diverse area. There's a lot of Southeast Asian. There's a lot of Indian community here, as well as a lot of, I believe, Mexican immigrants as well. And so it seems like the emphasis on academics is something that everyone can agree on. Like all this other stuff, how we think about social, emotional, cultural stuff, that is something that I think a lot of families would want the freedom to decide how they talk about those issues at home according to their own cultural values. But after the way that the pandemic has set back so many kids academically, it seems like making schools, refocusing schools on the purpose of schools, which is the academics, is something that people from all walks of life could agree on, and would also meet very liberal values around equality, because there are kids who Beaverton is also socioeconomically, there's a lot of variety. So there are kids who had the resources in their families to be relatively okay academically through the pandemic, and then other kids who are really held back by it. So.
It's widened the disparity gap for sure. And if I make a quick plug, I've written stories about this and published even data on how student assessment results have gone down, but graduation results have gone up. So that's an interesting one because the teachers can't take tests for you. Not that they would, but to see assessment results go down, but graduation goes up, pretty much tells you that they're easing their requirements. And so if you go to saveoregonschools.com, that's where I publish all my Substack information, and also my candidacy. You can see more information on Jeff4schools.com. There's so much more to cover. If anyone has any questions, you can reach out to me through either one of those, where I just love to have these conversations, talk about schools and answer questions for people, because I'm hoping that these are not divisive topics. I want to, just get kids back to learning, to help resolve the losses that we've saw through the pandemic, and make schools safe, and not burn out teachers so much and other staff. Reduce those class sizes, like we say we every year we say we're doing, but Beavertons are heading up.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the possible things we could talk about, but vote for Jeff.
Thank you.
Okay. All right.